Judith, wonderful to see you. Look, inflation rose to 5.2%. How much of this is a reflection of government policies, or is it only petrol prices, oil prices that we're looking at? And how much of it also has to do with, you know, what Terry McCrown describes as an off-the-leash Tony Burke, who's got these radical IR policies that are pushing up wages, you know, beyond inflation?
Well, good to be with you, Sharri. So petrol prices are contributing, but as you say, there are other factors, in particular rent rises. So what you have to understand about the inflation figures is that there are official quarterly figures, and they're kind of the comprehensive ones, but the ABS more latterly has put out monthly ones. So this week it was a monthly one, so it's not as comprehensive as the quarterly one. That doesn't come out until the end of October. But up until this point, there had been a consistent downward trend in the inflation figures, both quarterly and monthly. So I think Jim Chalmers might be being a bit hopeful in saying that there's nothing here. Because the thing you have to understand is that interest rates in Australia are not just set on the basis of Australian conditions. In fact, interest rates in Australia are quite low. And what's happening in the global oil market is bearing on both bond prices and interest rates and what we call the yield curve, the difference between short-term rates and long-term rates. And it actually looks like quite a turbulent time. So I think, you know, being sanguine as Jim is at the moment is, I think, rather surprising, really, because I think if I were to bet my house, and I guess there's a joke there with rising house prices, you'd have to say that interest rates are likely to stay high and for longer in Australia, and that's probably the best case scenario. And I think there is now a real possibility that the cash rate will move upwards, maybe not until 2024, but it's hard to see the ongoing decline that some had hoped next year actually occurring.
So there you are, Judith Sloan, predicting that rate rises will stay high across 2024. I guess we had been predicting that, you know, once inflation started to fall, they'd start to be cut, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen. And probably not a rate cut, probably not a rate rise with Michelle Bullock's first board meeting on Tuesday. But yep, you can. No,
I don't think so. I think they're not going to jump the gun on this. But another part of the story is, because, you know, the trouble with economics is that everything's connected, is the incredibly low value of the Australian dollar. So, you know, it's now below 65 cents US. And that, of course, itself feeds into the inflationary cycle because, as you know, imported goods become more expensive. And that in itself is a real worry. It's not a specific target of the Reserve Bank, the value of the Australian dollar, but they will be looking at that. And indeed, it's really an indicator that the Australian economy is not doing that well, the fact that the Australian dollar has been falling so sharply as it has all through this year.
I'd love to get your thoughts on the piece that Peter Costello wrote today in The Australian. He was speaking about monetary policy and how we expect it to do too much. He said this single lever, there's too much pressure on it. He points out it can't deal with climate change, the housing crisis, or make up for fiscal failure. Do you think the federal government has been too reliant on monetary policy and hasn't been pulling its weight, particularly when it comes to productivity?
Well, the truth of the matter is that this has now become a terrible political mess for Jim Chalmers. He commissioned a review. The review comes out with, you know, tens of recommendations, and almost that afternoon he says he's going to implement them without actually consulting, asking people who know about these things. And the thing is that there really is a distinction between mistakes that were made under Phil Lowe the Governor and the institutional arrangements that cover the Reserve Bank, including the board. And those, really what Peter Costello is saying, and I agree with him, is that there were mistakes. Whether they actually constitute an argument for shaking everything up is very unclear. So I think It's going to be hard for Jim Chalmers to walk back on this, but it's absolutely true that monetary policy should probably focus singularly on inflation. It can't do anything about climate change. It's not really the prime responsibility of housing affordability. And unless fiscal policy, budgetary policy, is basically working in combination with monetary policy, it's asking too much of monetary policy to do this stuff alone.
Right, Judith Sloan, thank you so much for your time.